Hey everybody, I'm Aline Thompson, founder of Treasured Ministries, and welcome to our Treasured Tribe Talk. I want to talk to you today about a very serious topic, and that's the topic of spiritual abuse. And the reason why it is serious is because it's very important to God, because when you're leading others, you're in charge of people, and people are God's most value. He places a tremendous value on people, and He really does care how people are treated. And sadly, inside of spiritual abuse, and I've been doing a lot of research on this, and there's many shades of spiritual abuse, and sometimes it's very severe. Other times it's more subtle. There's more, it will be tainted more by things like condemnation and coercion and using guilt and judgment to get followers to try to follow and control. And so there's many shades of spiritual abuse. And the reason why we need to examine this is that so you and I can walk wise. You see, God's idea of leadership is that leadership is a stewardship, and that which we serve others. But oftentimes, people might see leadership as a way to gain what they can get out of people, and leaders who calculate what they can get from people will not have the capacity to care for people. We have a charge to be wise and discerning so that God can continue to be who we give our free will to, so that you and I can be wise. And the other charge that we have is that every woman, in Treasure Ministries, at least we believe, that every woman is a leader. And whether it is that you're leading inside of your home and you're raising your precious children, and you may think, well, it's not really important, it's just routine. But did you know that in that routine and normalcy, that day in and day out of you doing what you do for toddlers and young children, that you're creating a place of security for them, and that's leading well? Or maybe it is that you're an entrepreneur. I got a prayer request the other week from an entrepreneur that's inside the Treasured Tribe, and she's getting ready to set up office buildings all over Europe, and she asked me to pray for her. And what she said to me was, please pray for me because I see the business that I'm setting up as an opportunity to provide a place for people to be able to work. And I understand that what I'm doing isn't about me. It's about opening up doors for opportunity. So as women, we lead, and it could be inside of our homes. It could be as an entrepreneur. It might be both. It could be inside of your church. You might be leading a small group, or maybe it is that God has placed, just a group inside of your neighborhood. And see, as women, we are always leading. And I don't have time to go into that, but there's so many examples in the Bible about women inside of leadership. And the first thing that I want to say is don't disregard the trust that God has given us as women He's given us this ability to nurture and to lead, and never disregard that. And that in your place of work, or inside of your community, that God will open up a door for you to lead. And that leadership is not, in a biblical sense, I don't believe is given by a title or is assigned through power. It is the way that we carry ourselves. And there's certainly leadership from a worldly perspective and leadership from God's perspective. And sometimes we can make the mistake of automatically giving our trust to somebody who carries a title, or we can automatically make the mistake mistake that because we have title, that entitles us to certain actions. And we're going to see that inside of our last passage, inside of 1 Peter 5, that with leadership, that leadership is a great trust. And that if we've been given a position of leadership, that we should get excited because God is going to do great things, but that we have a responsibility to lead with love and to lead others well. You see, leaders who lead well lead others to Jesus. And so inside of our passage, I'm going to start out, we're in 1 Peter 5, and I'm just going to start reading to you. And so it says, and so Peter is wrapping up his letter. And if you've been following us, we've been walking through the book of 1 Peter. And we know that Peter wrote this letter to encourage Jewish Christians at a time when they were being scattered and just all over the place, at a time when they were inside of government that was different from them, that when they were inside of situations where they were being unfairly treated. And so his final word in 1 Peter 5 is actually to leaders, and we're going to see why that's important. So in 1 Peter 5 it says, "And now a word to you who are elders in the churches. I too am an elder and a witness to the sufferings of Christ, and I too share in his glory when he is revealed to the whole world. As a fellow elder, I appeal to you." And so the very first thing that we see in this passage is that Peter is going to end his letter with a word to the leaders. In other words, Peter is saying, come right here with me. Right? Like, I want to talk just to the leaders because, see, leadership is an important trust that God gives us. And leadership by God's design, it isn't easy. It isn't easy because when you sign up to be a leader, it shifts. It's not about you anymore. It's about using what God has given you to serve God and to serve others. It's about understanding that the gifts that God has given to you, they're not there to validate you or to make you significant. They are to serve others. And oftentimes, that can make leadership a lonely place, or when you just find yourself leading, you're giving out and you're giving out and you're giving out. And the temptation can be inside of leadership, because I think that with leadership that there is some suffering that goes inside of that. And maybe you think on the outside, I want to be in leadership, right? And then once you get into it, you realize the weight and the responsibility of that, and that it's not always easy, that sometimes leaders have to walk alone, and sometimes leaders have to just put the needs of others before them, and leaders are looked at differently, and so you may not have all the freedoms of somebody else. And you can even take this down just even on a small letter, that as a mother, I can't just say everything in front of my children. I can't just do whatever I want to do, because you see, God has given me that trust of leadership. And a lot of times with my children, there was a time when they were little and I could take those babies wherever I wanted to take them, and I was in control, right? But then there's a time in leadership where God says, I want you to just shift, and I want you to build up where their interests are, and to sow into their lives. And so oftentimes as leaders, we find ourselves giving and giving and giving. And it's a place of unconditional love. And what can happen is that if we're not relying on God's care, we might be tempted inside of leadership. The enemy might tempt us, and we're going to see that it's the enemy that tempts leaders. But a leader may say, I'm doing all this, I deserve that. Or sometimes inside of leadership, and I think this happens so much, and none of us should say, well, that's for those leaders, but I could never do that. We don't need to be that way. We need to be on our guard, because sometimes what will happen is that leaders will get into leadership for all the right reasons. Because God's given them a gift and they want to serve other people. But see, it's when we have our platform that it will become our greatest test, right? That it's not in the times when we're not leaders, but when God has promoted us and when He's given us that place of position, that we might become lazy against the enemy's attacks and that we can fall to his prey. Here's a quote from Randy Alcorn: "The greatest danger of notoriety is to start thinking about you. People then exist to serve you." This is exactly the opposite of the servant mentality. Jesus came to serve and not to be served. And I wonder how many politicians step in with all the right motives and they really truly do want to change and they want to help people, but then they're given that platform of power. And the platform of power, it's too much for them to handle, and they start to see it as a way to serve their own needs. See, you and I need to be wise, and that is exactly why I believe that Peter ends this letter with a word for leadership. And he begins with his word for leadership, and he cautions his leaders. He says to them to just that leadership really can turn from caring for others to control of others to get your needs met. And it could be a need for significance. Like if I have people following me, that I'm valuable. It could be your need for worth. It could be a need for love. It could be a need for intimacy or for power. Maybe you felt powerless growing up and now you're given this leadership opportunity, and the lure of power that exists in leadership is ever present. And you and I must be careful in any leadership capacity that God places us in, that we will not fall prey to the enemy's schemes. Because you see, the devil will devour some of the most devoted leaders. He will devour them. And pride and the lure of power, it is his calling card. Because when we walk this way, it prevents us from walking inside of God's power. Now, I've read 1 Peter 5 many times, and of course, one of my favorite verses, and I'm sure it's yours too, it talks about, it says, humble yourselves under God's mighty hand, and at the right time He will lift you up. Give all your worries and cares to God, for He cares for you. Stay alert. Watch out, for your great enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for somebody to devour. And how many times have we read that passage? But, something that I saw inside of this week is that Peter was addressing leadership. And see, we need to understand that we can get into leadership for all the right reasons. But see, the enemy, he is looking for an effective way to take out the body of Christ, and he will target those in leadership. And it doesn't matter if you're a mother and you're leading children or you're leading a ministry. And let this be a sobering thought to us, but also a thought that can just set our sights, just that you and I, when we are called to make a difference, that we become dangerous to the enemy. And so we need to be on our guard. And there's really good news in this, so just hang in there with me. But I want to just go a little bit deeper into the advice that he gives. So Peter is cautioning leadership because of how the enemy will attack. Because the most devoted leaders become dangerous to the enemy, right? And so, in his agenda, and they become important to God's agenda. And so, see, the enemy, he's looking for where he can get a hook in you, and the lure of power and the need to be in control is where he will always make his play, because pride prevents us from walking in God's power. Now here's what he says. So he says this. He says, as a fellow elder, and don't you love that? In other words, I know what it's like to be a leader. I know what it's like to walk alone. I know what it's like to have the weight of leadership on you. So he says, as a fellow elder, I appeal to you. And then he says, care for the flock that God has entrusted you. Watch over it willingly, not grudgingly, not for what you will get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. Don't lord it over the people assigned to your care, but lead them by your good example. And when the good shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of never-ending glory and honor. So here we see this. We see that Peter is saying, care for the flock that God has entrusted you with. And so we need to always remind ourselves that when we are given a position of leadership, it's a trust. God has entrusted you to children. He's entrusted you to people maybe on your business team. He's entrusted you with that volunteer opportunity, whatever it is. And then it says, watch over willingly, not grudgingly, to remember that leadership is a privilege. And then he says this, and this is very paramount, not for what you will get out of it, but to serve God. And the reason is that leaders who calculate what they can get from people will not have the capacity to care for people. And it's a subtle shift that can happen. But what you see inside of very spiritual abusive places is that there are people that are using their leadership position and the word of God to gain control over people. Acts 20 talks about this, to gain a following. In other words, to get their needs met. And then inside of this passage, it says, don't lord it over them, but to lead them. Now, this is very significant, and this is very important for us to remember as women when we are trying to discern, is this good leadership? Because God's model for leadership is shepherding. Now, a shepherd with his flock, he doesn't keep them confined in a fence, and he doesn't keep a sheep on the leash. He's not controlling their every move. No, a shepherd leads through trust. A shepherd understands, he has to earn that trust of the sheep, and he calls out to the sheep, but then the sheep has a choice. Will they follow or not? And see, we need to look inside of God's example for leadership and hold that up against leaders that we are following and ask ourselves, are they respecting my right for free will? Or are they using fear and coercion and guilt to try to control me and to get me to do what they want to do? And I've read so much about this and just about like the cult leader mentality, and it's all about control. So you remember that picture of a shepherd. A shepherd will lead and guide, not put people on a leash, okay? And then it says, and so there's no lording over people, right? There's no demand that they follow. You know, Jesus was here, and the way that Jesus led, Jesus served people. And that's how he led. And it is so wild because you can read secular books on leadership, and here's what they will tell you, that coercive power will gain control initially, right? It'll gain control initially, that people will feel fear, that they will be afraid. It will gain control initially, especially from people who have a void in their life. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But enduring power comes from serving others. It comes from serving others. And if you want to think, lasting titles, Jesus says, you want to be great, be last. Serve others. And think about Martin Luther King and the way that he served, and think about how he is still leading other people today, and just the way that he led. And think about that. Think about Mother Teresa and she didn't demand a title. She was there for other people. And think about the way that her name still carries weight today. You see, servants could care less about carrying a title. They could care less about having everybody follow them. They want to follow God, and they want to love and serve people. How? By serving God. And finally is this. It talks about the fact that we will get a reward from the great shepherd. Now, the reason why this is important is because we can flip over to the other side in leadership, and we can get very frustrated. And if we don't believe, if we don't receive care from the great shepherd, do you know what I'm trying to say? If we don't seek him for our reward, that we're going to want that from somewhere, right? And so the important thing to do is that as leaders, we need to put ourselves under God's care. In order to truly care for others, we have to put ourselves under God's care with humility. If not, when we get to this place of power, we might just say, the rules don't apply to me, right? The enemy will tempt it like he did King David, right? And he was a great man. He loved the Lord. And see, we need to look at that story and say that none of us are beyond that temptation, right? And the reason why is because the devil will devour some of the most devoted leaders. Because if he can take out a leader, how many times have we heard a Christian leader that has done amazing things for God, and then they fall at the height of their career? They fall because they've had an affair, or there's been something with finances or anything like that. None of us need to sit in judgment of them, right? Because we need to be like this. Lord, let me every day walk in the humility of you. But see, we're never beyond that. But when that happens to a leader, people look in and they say, why would I want to follow God? Right? And it just crumbles it. See, the enemy is crafty, and he knows if he can take out a leader, then he can take out the crew. If he can take out, there could be, and here's the thing that you need to remember: the gifts and the call are irrevocable. So somebody can be extremely talented. They can be and the gifts and the call, the Bible says they're irrevocable. If God gives someone a gift to lead into, it's irrevocable. Do you know what I'm saying? And so somebody can really preach a moving message. Or they can know their Bible backwards and forwards, right? And but it doesn't mean that they can't fall. And in fact, when we get in that place of look what I've accomplished and look at everything that I've done, or when we're giving out, there's a temptation that can happen as we just want to take just a little. And let me just take this opportunity, and the devil tempts the greatest leaders, and he takes them out because it's an effective way to work to turn people away from the goodness of God. And that's why Peter is saying in this last passage, you who are leaders, and at Treasure Ministries, we believe that every woman leads. Every woman leads. You be on your guard. Because when you walk in your purpose, and again, it is not in the wilderness season, like where you're waiting for your purpose to happen. That's when we're dependent on God. It is in that season of plenty where our purpose is coming to pass and things are happening that we better watch out. Listen to what Deuteronomy 8 says. It says, beware in all your plenty that you do not forget the Lord your God and disobey his commands, regulations, decrees that I'm giving you today. For when you have become full and prosperous and have built fine homes to live in, and when your flocks and herds have become very large and your silver and gold have multiplied along with everything else, be careful. Do not become proud at that time and forget the Lord your God who rescued you from the slavery of the land. And remember that that's exactly what happened, that they forgot. And so there can become this sense of entitlement that happens, and we all need to be like, let this humble us. So then the question is, because you think, like, how does this happen? How do followers get attached to false shepherds? How does this happen? Well, it happens through voids in our life. And it's because we want a king. Now, we go inside the Bible and we find this. And this happens inside of 1 Samuel, inside of chapter 8. It said it happens when we feel powerless, when we're in a place of desperation and feeling powerless. And many people that are involved in cults, they will talk about just this need for family, and oftentimes that sort of provides that for them, or maybe it is, it could even be like this, that a woman gets involved in a narcissistic, abusive relationship because she's looking for protection in her life. So she lets go of just wisdom, surrenders that in order to have this protection, right? Now listen to this. This is 1 Samuel verse 8. As Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons to be judges over Israel. Joel and Abadiah, his oldest sons, held court in Beersheba, but they were not like their father, for they were greedy with money, and they accepted bribes and perverted justice. Finally, all the elders of Israel met at Raham to discuss the matter with Samuel. Look, they told him, you are now old, and your sons are not like you. Give us a king. There was a void. And we look to seek that void through a person. And then Samuel's displeased with his request, and God tells him just do, explain to them what this will mean, and but then do what they tell you to do. And so the people say, even so, even without all these warnings, we want a king. We want to be like other nations around us, and our kings will judge us and they will lead us into battle. And how many times, you think about just a powerful, charismatic leader and how sometimes it just is a draw for people, right, to follow them. And it's a void. And we have to be careful. And inside of this passage, inside of our passage in Peter, see at the very end of this, he says all power belongs to God. In other words, that we need to be very wise. And I'm not trying to really scare you guys, but I think that we need to be wise. And the very first thing as women that we need to say is there's one king in my life, and it's the King of Kings, and it's the Lord of Lords, and it's him that I choose to give my free will over to. And that if somebody is trying to lead me through coercion or they're, and see, God is my protector, God is my defender. If nobody else is there for me, God will love me. And so every void can be filled, so I won't subsess myself to follow under that just negative spiritual leadership. We need to watch where our allegiance lies. And all of us, and it doesn't matter. You can be a well-educated, just smart. It doesn't matter. When we want a king, and when we see the answer, the Israelites were in desperation because the priests, Samuel's sons were not doing what they were supposed to do. And so they cry out for king. And we get us in a situation where we feel powerless, and we might just latch on to just a leader that maybe looks great. Maybe they know all that in a bag of chips about the Bible. And maybe they've done all this, but are they shepherding? Or are they using leadership as a way to gain power? You see, we're going to see inside of this passage that in order to truly care for others, we have to put ourselves under God's care through humility. And that's because true leadership is cultivated through courageous, authentic humility that is often birthed through brokenness. I'll tell you what I love most about Hebrews chapter 11, which is the Hebrews, they call it the Hebrews Hall of Faith, and it just lists all these people, and they did great things for God, and it's great to read that passage. But what I love about that is that every single one of them failed at some point, and they walked through brokenness. And it's through brokenness that we finally get to the end of things, and we just say, you know what, I just can't fix this anymore. And I can't handle it anymore. And I just want to surrender. Some of the greatest leaders are ones who have walked through brokenness. In fact, I was speaking with somebody that was serving on a committee that was looking to find the pastor for their new church. And wisely, one of the questions that they had on their list was, have you been broken? Have you walked through a season of brokenness? Mm-hmm. And what's really neat about that is that we've been walking through the book of 1 Peter, and we've been talking about resilience, and you know, when we walk through brokenness, one or two things can happen. We can either buck back and say, I'm going to use my faith to survive, and determine that we need to be in control of people and in control of our circumstances, or we can just surrender and say, I can't handle this, and I can't do this anymore, God, and I need you. And see, inside of this passage, it's very interesting. It says this, so humble yourselves under God's mighty power, and at the right time he will lift you up in honor. Give all your worries and cares to God, because he cares for you. And that really is the way that you authentically surrender. You see, worry tells me that I'm still having that need where I need to be in control. And I think that's why God put that verse in there right after he tells people to, you know, to be humble. In other words, God says, just give it to me. And see, when we have lived our lives, and maybe we grew up and our father was an alcoholic, and we knew we just had to survive. And so that meant being in control of our circumstances. And if it was going to get done, we had to do it. And that can be just a survival skill that we learn from there. And so from that, we need to be in control, right? And it can be so subtle. But see, when we are walking in control, God's power cannot be released. And we'll bring that wound inside of leadership. And it will make, and I'm not talking about like the things that you need to do as a leader, being responsible to God and leading others well. There needs to be order and structure inside of leadership. But you know what I'm talking about. We've all been under awesome leadership. And we've all been under bad leadership. And there's a big difference. And I think a big piece of it is control. And see, worry comes from that need to be in control. And so he's saying, just humble yourself under me. And that's how you protect yourself from becoming a leader that is using leadership to get instead of not to give. And see, what happens is when we realize, and I want you to think about something right now in your life, because we need to bring this. We can't control people. We can control ourselves, right? We can have self-control. And so we need to think about a circumstance right now that we just can't fix. And we try to control the situation, and maybe we try this way, so this will be at home, and so we're walking on eggshells and blah, 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 and we're trying to do all these things and orchestrate everything, and maybe our motives are even good, right? But see, we need to realize that control is directly in opposition to God's will. And we must realize and that this can be frightening for us, right, to give up control and to rest in God's care, because we've spent our life trying to control everything, right? And inside of this passage, it says some really neat things about surrender. Because here's what I think. I've been to many, I've been to women's retreats and whatever, and they say surrender this and surrender that and write it on a piece of paper and rip it up or throw it in the fire or whatever, or tie it to a balloon and let it go, and it doesn't work, right? Am I right? I mean, you might want to do that, but then it just doesn't happen. But inside of this passage, we see the keys. We see the solution for authentic surrender. So it says this: so humble yourselves under the mighty power of God, and at the right time, He will lift you up in honor. Give all your worries and cares to God, for He cares for you. The first thing that we must realize is that we will be empty-handed for a period of time. But in due time, God will give us something better. And see, what happens is you and I might let go, right? And the letting go, that's a dying to self, not like giving up, not necessarily surrendering people. It's really just giving God control and just releasing people to God, right? But we might realize that we need to let go of something. But in this passage, it talks about, and in due time, God will lift you up. In other words, that when you let go, there's not going to be an immediate, sometimes God might give you an immediate, you might see why, you needed to let go, but that there is a due time. And due time will be different for everybody, but that there will be a period of time where you will have to let go of what it is that you're trying to hold so desperately onto. And what happens is, and usually the thing that we're trying to hold on to is that thing that we believe that will give us life and love. Right? And it can happen in such subtle ways. It could be like our family, like our kids are growing up and we're trying to hold on to them because we've received, do you know what I'm saying? But our boys need to grow up and they need to leave the house, right? And so we think, gosh, I just want to let go. I know I'm supposed to let go, but I can't. And see, what happens is we might let go, but then in the due time we get scared again and then we grab back and try to take control. Am I right? When we are left empty-handed for a period of time, what we need to remind ourselves is that we're putting ourselves under God's mighty power. Number 2 is this: what we are holding on to is really not ours. It's not. And that love, authentic love, never involves control. It doesn't keep people on a leash, right? We talked about that shepherd mentality. And so if God is asking you to surrender something or someone, it's never ours to hold on to. Number 3, we realize that while we tried very hard to play Junior Holy Spirit, like we put our badge on, we were going to fix our kids and we were going to fix our husbands and we were going to fix this situation, and we try hard, but it is a recognition that while maybe our efforts were even done for the right reasons, but that our power didn't work. It's when we say, you know what, I cannot fix this. And number 4, we need to realize that brokenness is a new beginning. It is a new beginning. And that it often happens through a divine appointment. See, here's what the 2 things look like. Because really, what humility is it is dying to self-will. Now that doesn't mean that your purpose, dying to that. It's not any of that. And some people will tell you that. I don't believe it. It's not a death of our God-given destiny, our identity, our personality, our giftedness. It's our death of our self-will. So that's the first thing. And the next thing that we do is we say, God, I'm going to let you call the shots. And we got to die to self to do that. And it can be very scary. But what will motivate us is just trusting God's care and not looking to people to take that care, right? Because see, pride Pride prevents me from walking in God's power. And then I might be looking to have my needs met by having power over other people. And that's when it can become dangerous. I mean, we can even want to get our validation out of our kids, right? And their performance. And that's when it gets dangerous. Do you know what I'm saying? In order to truly care for others, we have to put ourselves under God's mighty care through humility. And so I want to end today with these 4 points to give you, just to help you with this. And the number 1 point is this, is that to protect yourself from maybe giving people maybe a higher place than they should have. I mean, even like healthy pastors, they should never take the place of God. In fact, I tell my children, sometimes we might be listening to a sermon and we'll talk about it after church, and I'll say, well, I didn't agree with that point, but I love this point. And I teach my children that's healthy to do. And a good pastor, Paul said to the Bereans, check out everything I'm saying against God's word. And I'll tell you that as much as I spend time pulling away and studying and seeking God for a word, that I want you to follow him, and that that I as much as I want to accurately represent the word of God, that we all have a responsibility to discern what we're being taught and to not place our pastors on a level that only God should be. Not to give them that weight. And what will help us with that is worship. You see, sometimes we want a king because we can see a king, right? When I have to humble myself under God's mighty hand, there's this due time, and I might have to wait for God to come through, right? But in my waiting, I can worship. And worship is great because it reminds me of the greatness and the bigness of God. And it also reminds me of who gave me the ability to do what I'm doing, right? And praise is another thing. Praise will remind you of the faithfulness of God. Number 2, whatever it is in your life that you're trying to fix, tell God that you are tired and that you're ready for him to take over. Number 3 is this: develop a bold, and I mean big, bold prayer life. I mean really big. I mean, like, you start asking God for big things. You start crying out to him for your needs. See, because then you won't see leadership as an avenue to get your needs met. You've got to receive God's care in order to have what to give out. And if we believe that people are in control of our needs, well, a lot of times we just deny our own needs, or we don't feel like that we're worthy enough to pray, or some religious garbage that we have been taught about, that bold prayers are selfish, and it's not. You know what I think? I think that we can be better leaders when we are bolder prayers. And the last thing is this: if you are inside of a church where the leadership is controlling, you need to get out. I'm going to read this too. This is Remy Diedrich. Spiritual abuse will convince you that it is selfish to think of yourself. You are conditioned to feel guilty whenever you put your needs before the needs of the organization. Seeking help might even imply that your spiritual leaders are wrong and that you don't want to make that accusation. But if you want to regain wholeness, it is imperative that you get very selfish right now and seek the healing that you need. Now, what is he saying there? And he's saying, inside of his book, he talks about the fact that spiritual abuse is more common than we realize. It's not selfish to put yourself under God's mighty care, because when we put ourselves under God's mighty care, then we will have the ability to do what God has called us to do. And putting ourselves, a good leader will never want you to follow them. They will want you to follow the Lord, right? That's what they will want. And so if you're inside of that situation, you need to get out. And I don't know how else to say it. Like, I'm just going to be blatant about it. You need to get out. All right, so I want to just tie this whole thing up with a bow today. We've been walking through the book of 1 Peter. This study has completely rocked my socks off. And I started thinking about the fact, I'm like, we're ending on this note, right? But here's what I think. What if the greatest pain in your life could be the very platform from your purpose? What if that was it? And what if we didn't take the pain in our life and respond to that like resilience by trying to survive and trying to be in control? But what if we saw that as an opportunity to be broken and to be humble and to let it be our purpose? And see, that to me, that's true resilience, right? Resilience is resting in God. And I think that is what we've seen throughout this. And it's seeing those places of pain in our life, the way the enemy has wounded us or however, let that be the platform for your purpose. Now catch this. That's exactly what Peter has done inside of this letter. And the cool thing about it is that when Peter, began this, we know Peter's background and we know that Peter walked through times of trial and the times of trial that he walked through, that he denied Jesus and that he retaliated, right, when he cut off that ear, right? And so Peter now is using all of that and he's coming out inside of this letter and he's saying, I've been there. And I understand how trials can tempt you, but let me encourage you. What's that place of pain for you? I've been there inside of divorce, but let me encourage you. God is good and He will redeem and restore. I've been there. I understand what it's like not to have parents that nurture you, but let me show you, let me tell you about my life and how God nurtured me along the way. I've been there. I've faced, you wouldn't believe what I've faced and it had an impact on my life, but God allowed me to overcome it when I started listening to Him and let me show you these things. And see, that's what 1 Peter is all about. The very pain in your life can become the platform for your purpose. And that's when the brokenness all becomes worth it, when we see that as a birthing ground for us to begin to walk in humility.